Hi, I'm Samuel de Ver-Westerby, the Director of the European Neighbourhood Council, and I will briefly present our study on media consumption in Central Asia from this year, 2023, published in February-March and supported financially by Internews as part of a fund through the foreign policy instrument of the European Union. And the study has a quantitative and qualitative component. I will mainly be talking about the quantitative perspective in today's short presentation. And so when we were doing this media consumption analysis, we wanted to, first of all, try to add to the literature and make sure that it's kept up to date, since, of course, there are also many other media consumption studies out there, including our previous ones from 2021. And we also wanted to look at the changing nature of digital technology, younger generations and politics in the region, as well as internationally. And thirdly, we wanted to essentially, and maybe most importantly, better understand the Central Asian populations, their social fabric, their media preferences, especially with regards to the EU, but also in terms of what kind of how they feel about international events and what kind of media they consume. Moving away from the regional perspective and instead looking at country by country domestic news source preferences, we observed the following. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan stand out as having populations who primarily use social media for their domestic news consumption as opposed to TV. In Kyrgyzstan, the figure is a really high number, it's 72%. And in Kazakhstan, the figure is also high at 52% of the whole population. In Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, the situation is more inverted. So 64% of people in Uzbekistan primarily use national TV for domestic news consumption, while 38% use social media. And in Tajikistan, it's 64% who use national TV also, whereas it's only 31% for social media. Moving on to sources of international news, Central Asians get their international news in a more diversified way than domestic news, and social media appears to play a far bigger role, which of course also means that the type of disinformation that they're facing is different. Coming back to the point of before, when we look at Russian disinformation through television, then domestic news is of course a bigger danger. And TV is a bigger danger, whereas when we look at international news, then all of a sudden social media becomes a bigger danger. Zooming in again on Russian TV channels, it's clear again that age plays a very significant effect, as age groups over 55 plus watch nearly 4 times more Russian TV for international news compared to the age group 18 to 34. Despite age mattering when compared to domestic news, it nonetheless remains higher for young people, possibly because Russian TV gives more international news coverage and is perceived as having a higher quality of information on some occasions as well, or at least covering certain topics which are normally just not covered on domestic news channels. Moving on to questions about people's usage of state media, the findings of our study indicate that 39% of Central Asians follow state media on a daily basis. Older respondents age 55 plus are again more reliant on state media, constituting approximately 60% of all respondents who follow daily, while the share of 18 to 40 age group is almost 2 times less at 30%. Smaller percentages of respondents who do not follow state media at all demonstrate that respondents in urban areas are more likely to exclude state media from news consumption rather than rural respondents. When comparing each country's respondents' usage of state media for news, it's noteworthy to mention that there is a division. The highest state media usage is recorded in Uzbekistan, and then afterwards Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and the lowest amount of state news usage is in Kazakhstan. Concerning what Central Asians prefer to use in terms of social media and online platforms, the findings regionally show a majority preference for YouTube and Instagram, followed by minority preferences for Facebook and TikTok, while other social medias like Odnoklassniki or Twitter or LinkedIn are less than 10%. Across Central Asia, 75% of the survey respondents say that they use local language to obtain news. Russian language continues to hold quite a significant share, with 55% of respondents that mentioned that they use Russian language when reading and watching news. Respondents in urban areas and rural areas also differ in terms of language preferences. 66% of respondents from urban areas use Russian for reading the news, while the number of rural respondents is visibly smaller at 42%. Interestingly, when we look at trust in media and fake news, what we see is on one end of the spectrum, we have Uzbekistan, where 44% of the population completely trust state media, 38% somewhat trust, 12% somewhat distrust. And then in Tajikistan, you have 47% who completely trust, 34% who somewhat trust, 5% who somewhat distrust, and only 3% who completely distrust state media. On the total other end of the spectrum, you have Kazakhstan, where 24% completely trust state media, so far lower compared to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. 41% somewhat trust, while 17% somewhat distrust, and 10% completely distrust state media. Similarly, in Kyrgyzstan, 21% completely trust state media, 51% somewhat trust, 13% somewhat distrust, and 6% completely distrust state media. What's interesting, however, is that despite there, of course, being a relatively high amount of trust in state media from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, what we also essentially see is that in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan, there's a high level of distrust for state media. What is also quite interesting is that when we account for trust and also, complete trust and complete distrust in non-state media, so non-state actors, bloggers, influencers, and so on, what we see is actually that these countries similarly also display a very high level of trust in non-state media as well, which simply shows that the individual media consumer is perhaps not really capable of differentiating and is just generally trustworthy towards all types of media. Finally, when it comes to perceptions about the war in Ukraine, we had a careful look at Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. In Kyrgyzstan, as was somewhat expected, a quarter of respondents blamed the US for the situation in Ukraine, while also others blamed Ukraine, and a minority blamed Russia. Older generations were far more likely to blame the US and also Ukraine, while when we looked at younger populations, we saw the total inverse picture, and so there you had 33% of young people blaming Russia instead. And when it comes to Kazakhstan, surprisingly, on the general population, respondents are overall more likely to blame Russia compared to the US, and the Ukraine is blamed far less. And of course, when we account for age, this gets even more extreme, with even more people blaming Russia for the war in Ukraine as well. Based on this study, we recommend several things. First of all, we recommend increased funding and investment in media and content production across the whole of Central Asia. We also very much advocate for stronger cross-regional programs, increasing funding and investment in those cross-regional programs, especially between EU, Turkish, Caucasus, and Central Asia. We also strongly suggest that much more local language programs are needed, also to fight disinformation, and also that there has to be more targeted measures to take into account the survey data we have on media consumption, especially with regards to television and social media. And then finally, we strongly advocate that a very, very big push should be made by international institutions and the EU to support independent content production in Central Asia online, because what we see is that with the very diminishing amount of Russian presence, at least in TV stations, because of lowering numbers of young people watching TV, there is now a new opportunity to create an independent and more free media space, also to counter disinformation online. Thank you very much. That was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to any questions through email or virtually.